Alright, I'm Aaron Heber, and for my presentation I did Stanley Milgram and his experiments. And what the project was to decide whether it was immoral or moral what he did. First off, a little introduction about Stanley Milgram. This is him. This was source one from Griggs. He was born in New York in the 1930s. He lived in New York and went to school. He earned his bachelor's degree in Queens from Queens College. Then he went on to earn his PhD in psychology at Harvard. And then for the earlier part of his career, he studied abroad in different countries. And in these countries, he developed his theory of obedience. And I got this from the Replicating Milgram. And in other words, he coined his phrase was people obey no matter what. If they're in a situation where there's a person of authority, they're telling them to do something, they're going to obey. And this, kind of how people do this is based from the Machiavellian theory. And who Machiavelli was, he was an Italian philosopher from Renaissance Italy, and he came up with basically the ends justify the means, where he published a book called The Prince, and in this it was basically his manifesto about how he felt that government should be run in Italy, and the ends justify the means when the government should do whatever means necessary for them to attain their political means and just to do whatever they can to make their government work. It doesn't matter how they do this as long as the end result is what they wanted. And these are examples of basically Milgram's theory being proved correct, like the Holocaust, genocide in Africa, the Soviet Union, and how they made millions of people go missing. Adolf Eichmann, he was a leader in the SS, tasked for the logistics for sending people to the ghettos and sending people to the concentration and extermination camps. And at the Nuremberg trials, he pleaded ignorance. He said he was just following orders. Milgram's experiment. What he was a professor at Yale University at the time, and it was in the 1960s. And his experiment involved three people: the experimenter, the teacher, and the learner. And what it was, the experimenter would be placed kind of behind the teacher, so the teacher wasn't directly facing them. And they would bring in a teacher and a learner at the same time. But what the teacher didn't know, the teacher was the person being experimented on. What the teacher didn't know was that the learner was a paid actor. So what they told the teacher that this study was going to be how people can perform under stress, like how they can learn under stress. And so how they would do this, simulate this, was the learner would be hooked up to an electronic shock machine, and then the teacher would be in control of the shock machine. And so the experimenter would ask the learner different questions, and if the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher would have to give him a little shock, and the shocks would go, they would get more intense as the learner kept answering wrong. And so the teacher would keep going and going until there were a few people that stopped and said that they wanted to stop, and they actually did, but the majority of people in his experiment kept going until the end, which was a deadly 450 volts. And so the only shock that was given was the mental strain on the teacher, because they would bring the learner in after the experiment and tell him that it was all a guise. Okay, invalid results. Through my research, I felt that Milgram's test results weren't really valid because he achieved the data in his original hypothesis where since he came up with this theory, he thought that the most people that went through this experiment were going to go all the way through. They were going to listen to the experimenter and keep going all the way through the experiment. And so after Milgram's experiments, many of his subjects had to kind of like go. They needed psychiatric help because a lot of them kind of suffered a shock to the system. They were kind of shocked that they would let this person who they thought was being harmed go all the way. They thought that they were having trouble like dealing with that they were the person that they thought that they were causing this learner so much harm. And then, were these results really accurate? Before Milgram started his experiment, he did like a pre-experiment, and this was basically kind of setting up how the experiment was going to go, getting a feel for it. And through this, he saw like the responses that people would try and give to get out of the experiment. And so through this, he was able to develop kind of answers to get back at the people and keep them going on with the experiment. So in other words, he wasn't really testing like people like, naturally how far they would go, because he kept egging them on. He told them that it was necessary for the experiment and this was for science and that they needed to keep going. So I kind of felt that this made his results invalid. And then neuroselection. Over half of Milgram's subjects were educated white males, and then only 18% of them were Asian and 4% were African American. So I again felt that this kind of added to the invalidity of his results, because he wasn't really getting a feel for the general population. He wasn't like kind of reaching out to minorities. He was mainly sticking with white people. And then moral or immoral. One of the most shocking things that I found in my research was Milgram would bring in two friends. One would be the teacher and then one would be the learner. And so since the teacher wasn't able to see the learner, they would separate the friends. So this one friend would think that he's giving electric shocks to his other friends when he's really not. So that kind of suffered their relationship. But they felt that it was best that they covered this up. And these experiments happened in the 1960s, and this information didn't come out until the 1980s, right around Milgram's death. So I felt that this kind of led to my overall conclusion that it was an immoral experiment. Yeah, and they felt that this was too controversial to report. That's it.